Well, thank you so much, and thank you for your interest in this topic. I want to try to approach this from a little bit different angle. I want to talk about the private sector and the private sector's push for ESG, primarily through financial institutions, and I want to just kind of borrow some of the great ideas that you just heard from the ambassador. My new friend over on the side is going to help me out by advancing the slides, and I apologize if that becomes a little bit tedious, but I thought you all might want to see the documents I'm going to cite. So if we could go to the first slide. When we're talking about ESG, that stands for environmental, social, and governance, I think, as most of us know. I'm going to focus on the E. And when you boil environmental down, you're really talking about net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's the aspect of ESG that I want to talk about. Next slide, please. And then when we're talking about net zero, and when a company's committing to net zero, or a bank or an asset manager is asking a company to commit to net zero, it's not some abstract concept, it's concrete. There are what are called scientific pathways to get to net zero. And what you see in front of you is one from the International Energy Agency, which you just had defined for you a little bit ago. This was designed to inspire folks to get to net zero, to show that it is possible. And so I think it's important to look at the assumptions behind the folks who want to tell you that getting to net zero is possible. So what you're looking at in the red box, that is the current percent of global electricity generation that comes from coal and natural gas. So if you add the 24% from natural gas, the 43% from coal, you get 67% of global electricity supply comes from those two sources. You go 2 columns over in 2050 for us to get to net zero, that has to go to 0%. That's where the zero comes in. As you can see, that is a radical change with dramatic ramifications for the world and the electricity supply. If you could go to the next slide, please. Here's the assumptions under a net zero scenario, again, from the folks who want to tell you that this is possible. The assumption for net zero, by 2050, the economy doubles, energy usage declines 8%. That makes me a little bit concerned right there. If I'm supposed to use less energy in an economy that's twice as large. It's supposed to cost $100 trillion to get to net zero. If you add up the equity exchanges all across the world, that's about 90 trillion. So we're talking about a lot of money being spent in an era of inflation and large deficits. Unfortunately, the technology does not exist. According, again, to the folks who wrote the pathway, half the reductions by 2050 come from technology that does not exist. And we need to dramatically expand wind and solar. If you could go to the next slide. We can see, as has already been brought up, when you look at the supply chain for wind and solar, it is much different from the energy independence that we could enjoy today under different leadership. Wind, 80% of the components are coming from China. Solar, around 70%. These are from the New York Times and from the International Energy Agency. And then when you get below the components and you look at the ingredients, the processing of the metals, it is entirely dominated by China. And then if you go to the source of the metals, especially for rare earths, that is also dominated. Now, theoretically, you could say we can change our permitting process. We'll start making it easy to build factories in the United States again. Maybe we can recreate this whole thing. That's possible. It would require a giant mind shift in this country. It might be a good idea to see if that happens before we have this kind of dependence on another country. Also, I just put on the bottom, again, a graphic from the New York Times looking at China's progress toward net zero, not very encouraging. If you can go to the next slide. So let's look at the world. Are we getting to net zero? Again, when you're an asset manager or a bank and you're telling a company you need to get to net zero because there's a financial purpose, because 91% of GDP has said they're getting to net zero. Well, let's look at that. What's actually happening? The green line is net zero. That's a sharp decline. The orange line, that's what's actually being enacted. And I have to remember my colors here. The yellow line, those are the pledges. Those are the net zero pledges. There's a big difference called an ambition gap and an implementation gap. might be wise to see what is actually implemented. Only as of December of last year, only 10% of net zero commitments were actually binding. Can we go to the next slide? So here's kind of a structure. I think this is an easy way to think about the pressure on a public company. We've already talked about the pressure from the regulators, starting from the financial stability boards of the SEC, the Treasury, to the bank supervisors. But let's talk about some pressure from the private sector. So there's a group called Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which came out of COP26. Mark Carney, Michael Bloomberg has a number of sub-alliances, one for insurance companies, one for banks, one for asset managers. The goal of GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is to transition the entire global economy for net zero. If you read their press release, it says we have amassed $130 trillion of assets in this coalition. Remember, we only needed $100 trillion to get to net zero, so now we have more assets than we need to get to net zero. We're on track, we can do this. And the way this occurs is that insurance companies say, we're not going to underwrite you unless you're net zero compliant. Banks say, we're not going to lend to you unless you're net zero compliant. Asset managers say, we're going to vote against your board of directors, and we're going to vote for shareholder resolutions that will require you to be net zero compliant. So next slide, please. Here's one of those groups among asset managers. This group's called Climate Action 100. Here's the benchmark. You can look this up on their website. They have a benchmark for what they claim are their target companies. There are about 160 or so of those. And so they come into a company and they meet with the CEO. And imagine the pressure that you're under if you're the CEO. And you know that these folks, these asset managers who have joined this, can vote up to 20% of the shares in your for your directors. And that's because we all, because of the rise of passive investing, right? We trust managers like State Street and BlackRock and Vanguard with our votes, and they're able to cast those votes. And if they all join these initiatives, they can cast them jointly and they can shape the behavior of companies. So here you see they're asked, as a company, have you committed to net zero? Do you have a long-term target? Do you have a short-term target? Do you have a medium-term target? Is your capital being allocated in line with these targets? Now, if you ask the asset managers, they'll say, hey, chill out. We're just asking for disclosures. What's wrong with transparency? Well, look exactly at what's being required to be disclosed. This is like if my wife were to come to me and say, Paul, let's have some transparency. I want you to disclose your weight reduction target, your long-term target, your short-term target. And by the way, that target needs to line up with 180 pounds, or there are going to be real consequences. This is not about disclosure, folks. This is about changing behavior. Don't be fooled for a second. Next slide, please. These are the specific criteria that a public utility is supposed to meet. And remember back to the first chart, right? 67% goes to zero. That's how we get to net zero. Well, here the public utility specifically is asked, have you assigned a retirement date to every natural gas and coal company, or every natural gas and coal facility in your company? These are necessarily functional assets, being asked to retire them early to meet an environmental goal, not a financial goal. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about how the banks do this. The bank organization is separate. It's called the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And here they've structured it kind of interestingly. They have an arm of the UN Environment Program, that actually supervises the bank's observance of their commitment to get to net zero in their lending. You can see here attributable GHG emissions line up with net zero. That's the net zero commitment. Next slide, please. And then if you look at all the different banks, you say, well, you know, businesses are sort of like countries. They say they're going to do something, but then they don't, and they do a lot of things for PR. Well, if you go through the bank's websites, they all file this annual report, TCFD report, when they've joined this initiative, and they all say, we're aligning our lending, the large banks, with the Net Zero Banking Alliance guidelines. These are the UN guidelines on how to get to net zero, and we're all cutting emissions within the same sectors by approximately the same rate. Now, imagine the power. You have the largest 6 banks. You have 50% of the banking assets in the US. If you can get these 6 banks to all do the same thing, do you even need to come to this building? Do you even need to pass a law? You have the market concentration that you need to change the way business is run without being worried about getting voted out of office. You can just flip through the rest of these. These are just to show that, next slide, that's Citi. Next slide, that's JP Morgan. There's Morgan Stanley, see Net Zero Banking Alliance, cutting emissions, same target. And just, you can stay on this last slide. There was a gentleman earlier who talked about conflicts of interest that companies face. And as financial institutions, there are a lot of conflicts of interest. When you're managing assets, you want to charge a fee across a pool of assets. The larger that pool of assets is, the more money you make. The larger the fee is, the more money you make. Asset managers make up to 5 times as much money selling an ESG fund. They have a big incentive to pump this stuff, even if there's nothing there. Asset managers also have clients who are explicitly political, particularly pension funds. You can look at a letter that the New York Comptroller wrote to BlackRock saying, unless you are keeping fossil fuels in the ground, we are pulling our money. Now, the way for an asset manager to deal with what would you do if you're a rational asset manager? You have a chunk of money, $3.3 trillion, that says we want you to get to net zero across all your assets, and then you have a chunk that says we don't care. You try to come up with a financial reason to get to net zero so that you can manage all those assets and keep making money. That's the incentive that these folks have. The other incentive is to capture the Chinese consumer. Very high rate of savings, obviously large economy, lots of economic growth. When BlackRock was the first company approved to sell mutual funds, first foreign-owned company approved to sell mutual funds, about the same time they said triple your allocation to Chinese assets. Turned out not to be very good advice. But somebody wrote an op-ed at that time, someone who is not known as a strident defender of US national interests, wrote an op-ed and says this is a big national security risk when you have America's largest asset manager have these commercial motivations in China. Does anybody want to guess who wrote this op-ed? It was George Soros. And if George Soros is concerned enough about this behavior that he writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, watch out, America, your national security is at stake, then I think we should all take this very seriously. Thanks so much for your time.